Hello, everyone. We continue our conversation here today with Jim and Michael on the social ledger, the next generation social ledger. We've been talking a lot about the social ledger and the architecture of this thing that we're building. And we're getting closer, I think, step by step, day by day, to actually begin the implementation. So we've looked at, evaluated, instantiated, created some of the basic tools that are necessary. And I think we're now close to deciding on what kind of stack we're going to use, our development stack. Keeping in mind that the whole platform, the whole notion of the GraphQL thing is really not tied to any specific backend, right? It's not tied to any specific database type or style. And we can keep this pretty much agnostic, right, across the board. So we can pick and choose whatever backend we're going to store our data. We can pick and choose whatever API we use to tap into other data sources, right? And we can see how we can connect all of those in this GraphQL orchestration layer, as Jim likes to call it. So today I want to go over two use cases for the social ledger that came up very recently. One inside the Digital Life Collective, and one from the conversation community, which is run by a Swedish guy, a friend of mine, called John Kelden. And he has some great notion of, how do you actually starting to slowly pull people out of Facebook and move them into new environments where they can create, sort of build sense-making abilities, and write about the good stuff versus the chatting stuff and the flat stuff that's happening inside environments like Facebook, Twitter, and so forth. So that's the agenda for today. Thanks for peeking in. Let's start with the first topic. Let me see if I have a slide for this. Sorry, it's a bit slow here. I hope we're not breaking up here. Oh, you guys still there? I think I'm frozen here.
You're okay. You're working.
I'm working, yeah. Okay. All right, I have to close some windows here. Probably too many tabs open, like you do, Jim. Let me close most of them.
You use one tab yet?
No, that's just escalating the issue.
Well, it gives you a one-button way to suddenly close all your tabs with a way of recovering them.
I know. I want to develop a discipline that says you don't need all the tabs. You just work on them, you come back. It's like you go into the tree and then come back to the parent, and then eventually to the root, and then everything is gone. Okay, let me share my screen now. Okay, so recently we discussed a new thing for the collective, for the Digital Life Collective, called the pseudo protocol. So the pseudo protocol is a way, and I renamed that a bit now, to give what we call power cards to individuals in the collective. And so the pseudo protocol is leaning, of course, from the Unix command that gives sort of control or authority to a person or a group, to run program run a program with specific privileges. So that the root user of the system doesn't have to do everything himself, herself, right? So this is similar to the power of attorney, where you assign powers to some lawyer that can work on your behalf, in some other country or some other case, whatever it is. So the sudo command for the collective would be a way to say, hey, we have all these different areas, and we don't want to centralize or create a command and control structure. Rather push that to the edges, right? So that's the idea, pushing it to the edges and letting people decide at the edge what to do. In order to do that, they need to be aware that they're allowed to do that, right? There's nothing holding them back. But one way to sort of officially acknowledge that they can do, in fact, run some things on behalf of the collective, we want to issue this sudo command, right? So give that person a sudo power. So without further ado, let me show you now how I think this could be mapped to the social ledger. Let me see, where's my thingy here? Here you go. Okay, so here's the screenshot. Let me make this bigger here. Oh, my system is really slow here. Move this around. Okay, well, this is building up there. Let me go back to the metaphor that we are creating here with the social ledger, which is a card-based interface. It's one of many interfaces, right? So if you say you can give someone sudo power using a card-based interface, so we could do something like, adding metadata to a card that says, hey, you have now marketing sudo powers over the collective, right? And we can now attach any activity around that power, to the social ledger. And the way this would work, you can simply say what kind of power is available. Oh, shoot. Okay. Do you see the screen here? Maybe I don't go full screen.
Yes.
Okay. Maybe at least
yeah, that's it.
Cool. The presentation thing doesn't work for some reason, but if you see the screen, that's great. So, oops, now it's loading. Oh. So you have a card, right? And it gives you a sort of marketing sudo power over a specific domain inside the collective. So that means if you're a holder of the card, if you have the permissions, the privilege to use that card, then you can do things like sending out a newsletter, things like using the letterhead for some official, documentation, instantiation, exchange of information with other parties. You can look at the design things that we created on the website. You can create new content for the website. So all of these things would enable you just by gaining access to the sudo power card for marketing. So I've been thinking now, how do we express that in a social ledger? So on the top left side, you see here's a sudo power card, right, with a big button in the center here, called claim for now. I just didn't find a better word for that. And on the right side, you'd have the ability to sort of edit this card, right? So one of the main features of these cards is you can edit them, obviously. And that means you can see a form like this here, where I can see fields on the form, and the most important one here on top is describing the scope, what I call scope of this power. So now I'm saying this is marketing, so this is a marketing sudo power card. So there's marketing, and there's also attached to that a subdomain already. We had a good conversation with Christina yesterday, right? And she was bringing up the notion of, whoa, if you give me sudo powers over marketing, that's a little bit too much. I don't want that. There's way too much included. Maybe I screw things up, but it's not good. So the notion of, okay, let's break it up into smaller pieces here, smaller chunks of the marketing sudo power. And that is much more, manageable, I think, to give those powers further on to other people, down the chain. Again, not chain of command here, but just the ability to authorize them to have them, give them the autonomy to actually do and run things on their own. So here in this example that I put together would be marketing/newsletter. So newsletters as a subdomain of marketing, right? And you'd say, now, okay, now you're in that scope. What does that mean? Who has the power to do what? And then you see this list underneath. Let me pull up my laser pointer here. The list that says here are the users with this specific power. So here are the users with the marketing/newsletter power that we've activated over time, right? So I put Steve Taylor here as sort of the root person. He's on top of the list, and you can see that because his date when he activated this power is the earliest one. So some arbitrary date, 2017, right? So he is sort of the holder of the marketing power. And he then added other people to that. So there's Michael, there's Jim, there's Gary, right? So 3 other people who now have marketing pseudo powers over the newsletter thingy, right? And you could extend that. If you have the right privileges, you can add more users to this list here and activate their marketing pseudo powers, right? And by activating, it can be as simple as, I just put this UI control here. It says flip it on or off. We also talked about last time in the example that Michael got pseudo power over marketing, and then he sold all of our newsletter contacts to some third party, right? And of course, we can't let this happen, right? So we said there's a revoke mechanism inside the pseudo control, the pseudo protocol, which says, okay, simply turn that off. On the UI, as simple as, from on to off. And then it says here, revoked since, and then the date this happened, right? So this incident happened on, or it was active on March 4. So that means if you look at the pseudo power for newsletters, Michael does not have them anymore. And I do think we want to keep that record in here just to see that, yes, he got pseudo powers at some point, but then it got revoked for whatever reason, right? And this could also be a temporary thing, say, hey, for the next month or so, I'll revoke it and see what happens. And then I reinstate it just by clicking on this thing here. And then here's Jim and here's Gary, right, with these pseudo powers. And then the second thing I could see happening in the social ledger is that we have a quick, description of the protocol, description of the do's and don'ts here, in this case, of this power. So you could say the typical activities you have if you've been given marketing newsletter powers is, well, you can access MailTrain as an admin. There's no granular, access control in MailTrain. It's only admin or non-admin. So you can access it as an admin. You would then view subscriber and member lists. These are the 2 big lists we have in DigLive. And you'd have access to the newsletter templates and the variables. So you can plug in the usernames if they exist, right? And you can change the newsletter template. You can start a new campaign in MailTrain with the existing lists, right? With subscriber and member lists. You could access that. And you can create content for a new campaign. Or you can set up a new email automation chain. That's a big feature in MailTrain. We're using that at DigLive to sort of onboard new members. So they get an automatic email every week. In the first couple of weeks, they join the collective. So that happens all behind the scenes. And if you have the pseudo power now, you can actually go in there and say, okay, let me set up another email campaign, automation campaign for something else that I think is useful for the collective, right? So it's all in the context now of the collective. What's good for the collective, what helps other users, what helps us grow, what helps us get more people on board. And we could also list some of the don'ts, right? So the track newsletter stats would be a don't, and share, obviously this thing here, share emails with third parties is a don't. Just to, keep people alert to the fact, okay, these are the typical things I can do as a newsletter pseudo holder, or what I cannot do in this case, right? So that's my idea for a simple mapping of the pseudo power card to the social ledger. And the one thing I was thinking about is, you don't want to have so many cards floating around. If you clutter the interface with lots of pseudo cards, you get confused and what's going on here. I'm thinking if we can sort of concentrate that on a single card per domain. So there could be a marketing pseudo power card, a legal card, an operations card, a projects card, some kind of these, domain areas. And these are separate cards. And then you open the card and you edit those. And then you can actually, if you want to, that's the thing, if you want to, you can add a subdomain to that. But if you want to just keep it plain flat marketing, everything in marketing, because our marketing function is not that big at the beginning, that's fine. Just give them pseudo power over marketing. But we do have a record, and that's important. So the moment you claim this pseudo power, right, it goes in as a record into our metadata container, right? So it's stored in some backend database. And again, because of the layer we create with GraphQL, this can go into a SQL database, a Mongo database, a non-SQL one. It can go into a holochain, an R-chain, a blockchain, whatever, right? So it's a record, ideally immutable. That's why we're long-term looking at some of the blockchain technologies and storage mechanisms. But it really doesn't matter, because it's just a storage container for the fact that you claimed pseudo powers, and we now have that kind of record. And then there's also an option, since we're tapping into a lot of APIs, right? We could also tap into the Mailtrain API here and sort of extract some additional information here. I'm not sure how far I'm going to go there to start weaving, all of these interfaces together, but that could be an option. I can see that, that if you give them specific newsletter access, then maybe Mailtrain is notified to say, hey, this is a new user, or grant this user access or some other control checking mechanism to make sure he or she has access to Mailtrain. So we could stitch that into another API, which then GraphQL would just handle as another query, right? So if the card says claim, maybe it checks if you have an account first. So the logic layer, the orchestration layer would say, have you got an account there? No, do that first, right? So there's another step you can go through before you can claim the marketing/newsletter pseudo power. But to me, it's very descriptive, so it's something that can be used right out of the box. You see a pseudo power card marketing, you basically open it and you can see, okay, these are the do's and don'ts for this specific domain. Makes sense to me, right? I want to claim that, and then some button to say claim power, and then it goes back up the chain here, says, okay, who's the oldest? Who's the first person who was in that list, right, or in that group? Then that person would be notified and say, hey, there's now Joachim wanting to have additional pseudo power for marketing, and Steve and Michael would be notified, and we would issue then the confirmation that you can handle it. Okay, I'll stop here for a moment. Yep, sorry about the phone call here.
I think this is a wonderful presentation. The only thing I would like to add to it is that for the do's, we want to have a hot link to do that thing. I mean, we're giving the pseudo specific capabilities, and when possible, a link or API that they're being given access to can be defined where they can use the pseudo power directly from the power card. You're on mute, Joachim.
Sorry. Thought I don't do this anymore. So this is a notion of, now I like this a lot, Jim, where you have basically, here's a pseudo power card, right? And over here is another card for service, a service endpoint like Mailtrain, right? And they can actually communicate these two cards, right? Because if you want to have access to, say, a Mailtrain service endpoint, it could talk to this card and say, hey, does Jim have pseudo power for Mailtrain, which includes the newsletter stuff, right? And then they agreed, yes, you can, and then bam, you're inside this environment. Something like this, right?
Yeah, but I'm just saying that you want a connection from the pseudo card to the Mailtrain card that it
Yes.
gives you a permission to. So by putting links in the do's there, you're creating a link to the card that does that thing. Okay, and and again, in the long term, we want to be able to very finely tune exactly the card that they are given permission to in terms of maybe they can only produce a newsletter on Tuesday. But this, I realize it's getting into more, but I think that this basic ability to give a fine-grained permission is a user-managed authorization that fits into the social ledger framework very nicely.
Great. I think so too, Jim. That's excellent food for thought here, and really the way how I want to build this out. So again, we want to push stuff to the edges. If that team, if that person feels like, hey, we need to add more to that pseudo power, say, pull in the mail train, pull in a calendar scheduling service, let's say, right? If that's important, yes, let's add that to the mix here. So suddenly that pseudo power gives you, control over more resources, right? Over more tools that you have at your fingertips. And you're the one who can decide, how do we weave this together? And what does it mean to send a newsletter? So that means we have to schedule some kind of an event. You have to log that in a calendar somewhere and it be there, right? So we make it explicit in the UI that says, so here are 3 other cards you might want to consider with this kind of pseudo power. I think you're right. So that fits all together. It does create, some thinking around this orchestration layer. It can get fairly complicated. I'm calling it, not complex, but
also associated with giving the card. I mean, there's one thing for the proof of concept and showing it, but yes, there's an onboarding process which may or may not be automated that takes place to actually implement the privileges for the user that you're granting. Mm-hmm. And these set of steps are step 1 are handled by humans. You add them as an admin to the thing, to the mail train interface. Then someone says, well, wait, I can just access with GraphQL the mail train admin interface and add that person with one command.
Right.
And so they turn that step into a card, so to speak, which is part of this onboarding process that takes place in granting all the capabilities, and it's really a capability-based model. Mm-hmm. That we're trying to build here. So this is a wonderful step in the right direction, but it does come into the how we're doing the process of orchestration and how that fits in to the social ledger architecture, because there's processes associated with all these things.
Right, Jim. And that was the intention here, right? To show there's a possible case here, use case for the social ledger, and specifically on actually something we just created, we're just about to launch in the Digital Life Collective. And hey, by the way, we can map that to the social ledger. Here's how it would be like using that tool versus doing everything manually, right? So you can write it in a spreadsheet, of course, too, and keep track of it. But it is a good case to implement, and it fits into, as you said, into the architecture and the overall design of the social ledger. Okay, step 1. Step 2, let me talk about one other use case, which is the conversation community. So here is conversations that mind and matter. That's the headline of John Kelden's conversation community. It's a fairly large community. He has currently almost 5,000 members there. And a lot of them very active. But the way John runs the community is mostly in a very, very particular, pattern. He loves pattern languages, so he created his own pattern of how do you engage people in a conversation inside the conversation community, right? So a lot of this stuff is very meta thinking. That's quite fascinating. You should read some of the posts here and the comments and response to that, right? It's really fascinating. Here's a recent one talking about Facebook again as a platform that's now slowly but maturely sinking. We all hope, right? but you can take a look at some of these comments. It's Celine actually also part of the conversation community, who's also in Change Agents Worldwide. So it goes on and on. So there are these conversations. And what's interesting here, the way he structures the conversations are into sort of topical areas. So here's one example. It says 21C, 21st century awareness, social. So here's anything around social development, social cognition, social learning inside the topical area, right? So he repeats these posts now by these topical areas. Here's another one, 21C platforms is a domain almost, so it's a topical domain, and then a subdomain is the understanding here, right? And then he finds a good post, or he writes something. He's a good writer, so he writes a lot himself. Posts that on Medium too, and links that back to Facebook. And so he really has fascinating topics, right? 21C literacy, distributed ledgers here, and he pulled up a tribal thing, the Yurok somewhere, lived on the west coast of the US, and gets into a discussion here on how that fits into our 21C thinking around these different topical areas, right? Sorry about the phone here. Let's ignore that. So the thinking now is, okay, so John has created a wonderful community here, and structured it very well, and has a good engaging or onboarding mechanism to bring people on board. But what he wants to do is he wants to go deeper into the subject matter, right? He doesn't want to stay at the surface of what Facebook does, right? So Facebook is typical. The cat gives the opinions, the content marketing pieces, right? That's what Facebook sort of reinforces, right? So they want you to stay in that narrow context and frame of mind, right? There's no way it would support something that breaks out of that box, because they have to feed, obviously, their advertisers here, right? And here's where it gets interesting. I was talking to John about, well, we can actually provide these other spaces that people can dive into and explore things much further. And that's where I see part of the social ledger coming into play, where we have these experience spaces, right? So if one of the, say, topics here in the conversation community is 21C platforms, right? So we have a corresponding space over in the social ledger that can dive into 21C platforms. And then it becomes a whole different engagement space where we now put all of the social ledger protocols and tools and techniques at the fingertips of anybody who is willing to join us over there in that other space, right? So you can see, say there's a card, just like this card here, right? So there's a corresponding card in the social ledger that says, here's the post that originated in Facebook, right? We can bring that over to that social ledger experience space. And then we can add to that now other cards, right? So you get to see new people coming on board. You can have a conversation with them. You can open a chat space like Mattermost, just like adding a new channel on this subtopic here, say 21C platforms and understanding. Create that channel, open up a corresponding channel in Mattermost where you can get into deeper, rapidly flowing conversations around, say, this topic. And you can do other things like, open maps, create meta maps, create presentations, create documentation, anything you want in that experience space, in that corresponding experience space over in the social ledger, right? And here's the thing. We don't lose that connection to the Facebook environment, right? So from the social ledger, of course, you can always come back to the conversation community and continue public conversations over there, right? So that link is preserved, in both directions. And you can oscillate now between, being in the conversation community on Facebook and creating something new in the social ledger space, right? What we call sort of the sense-making environment, where you can tap into a lot more, powerful tools and APIs that we could add to that space, right? That help you in your thinking, right? Move towards more of the climbing metaphor. So John is pointing out, see the conversation community as the village, as the starting point, and then from there you can walk up to Basecamp. Just like we created a Basecamp for the social ledger now, there can be other Basecamps, obviously, for work in the conversation community, right? On specific topical areas. So you can go there, meet other people who are actually interested in this topical area. John keeps posting, other stuff in the same topical area, right, which would show up in the social ledger. And you can engage them over there and eventually create something, right, do something, and accumulate all of the activities. And, by the way, also record these activities in the social ledger, right? So you know who was engaged. And eventually, if we come to a point where, hey, there's a deliverable coming out of this, something that's of value to other people, that they want to buy this, want to use it, want to do something with it, they can, right? Because we now have a record of the people who engaged in that activity, engaged in that creating that deliverable. And we now have the ability to sort of go from the interaction that's happening, that happened, to the transaction part, right? To say, okay, there's value, somebody wants to use it, there's a transaction now happening, which goes then deep into what currencies are we going to introduce in this space, right? And ideally some kind of a mini circular economy in that space where, we have interested parties, where people who offer this, who co-created this stuff, and then people who pick and run with it and say, okay, that's a value in my space over here.
Spaces within spaces there.
Yes.
And, so economies in plural. We're really talking, once you propagate a mechanism for propagation, your cat is out the bag. So we've got to look at this as being multiple spaces with multiple, multiple ecosystems within them.
Mm-hmm.
Excellent. Yes, lovely. Your last comments really tie in with the open value networking community, which is part of the platform cooperative issues and everything else. It's how do we keep track of what we're doing together? Anyway,
great.
Please carry on. This is really fast.
Yeah, how do we keep track of doing things together? That was another topic in terms of our sort of intangible assets we're creating that currently just cannot be measured, cannot be recorded. We could do that with social ledger, right? We can actually say you were there, you've done that stuff. And if that leads to value creation on the other end, yes, we have a record for that too. So what you said last time, Michael, money as a technology, right? I love that expression. So there's things that come out of this that says, well, there's things like memory, right? So who was actually attached to that value creation? We can preserve that information in the social ledger as a record, as an immutable record, by the way, right? Because we're using some kind of blockchain, holochain, R-chain infrastructure.
Holochain is my preferred option at this point, far ahead of everything else. But that's an insertion.
Okay. See, right. To me, I'm becoming increasingly, open to, it doesn't really matter what's the current stable environment we can use, we can tap into, what is the best API that these guys provide to use out of the box, right? And then let's use it. And if we find out it's too expensive, too complicated, not mature enough, then we could choose another one, right? So that's the whole flexibility of the social.
Yeah. Long live open source.
Right. That's right. So anyway, that's the other topic, right? So I'm exploring that more deeply now with John Kelton in the conversation community, and creating this link, right, between these groups that are creating these what he calls hubs now, so other centers of interest outside Facebook, right? Sort of a slow offboarding here, which aligns nicely with this trend of all the stuff that people realize are going wrong in Facebook now, right? and the trickling that starts to happening for users seeking other places, other spaces to go to, right? And of course, you encounter the typical things like other open source platforms, other co-op platforms, other activity-driven chat spaces. But what we're doing with the Ledger, I think, is something fairly unique, because we would give them an opportunity to explore a whole new space where they can pull in the tools they need, right, to create the solutions they need for whatever topic they are talking about. And it's a meta, again, it's this meta body, which John was talking about, the commons, creating a commons for some of this stuff, that then where people find each other and have new conversations and new transactions happening. This can all happen in this meta body of a social ledger, right? If you see a lot of different spaces popping up, people finding each other, people seeing and relating to what they do, then suddenly we can have great many not only conversations but actions happening in that space, and value transactions too. So it's super promising. I'm looking forward to that, especially because this is a large, we're talking about Facebook here, extracting some of the users here. And if that turns into a flow of users, then I'm out of here.
I saw a post yesterday about Terence McKenna saying that the thing you have to detach from is your culture, because it's not your culture. You're getting what you are fed, what you are being fed. So this concept of offboarding into communities of, purpose, validity, locality. I mean, obviously, this is very nice indeed. And, yeah, offboarding.
Offboarding it is. All right, let's switch gear now. So that was the two use cases, right? So we talked about the pseudo protocol for the Digital Life Collective, and we talked about the conversation community here as another use case for the social ledger. So we'll see where that takes us. But now let's go back to some of the architecture and implementation on our side, right? So Jim, you had installed the first stack here. Let me go back to this document here. I was reading it this morning here. This document says how to build a GraphQL server, right? Using Apollo. That's what everybody's using. We saw Amazon AWS is using Apollo. The GraphQL guys are using Apollo. Meteor guys are using Apollo. Everybody seems to use the Apollo library, the client and the server and the engine. It's three pieces here, right? So some stuff that runs on the front end, stuff on the back end, and an engine to measure and to cache some of the data traffic there. So very interesting. And I see what you've done. You set up the server, Jim, and set up the graphical, I don't know how to pronounce that, GraphIQL, where you can see if it's up and running, right? Test strings one. So graphical, yeah, sounds good. What graphical is, it's on the left. You have two panes here, right? On the left side, you have the pane where you can enter actually queries, and you can not only do queries, you can also do mutations. So you can actually type something that says, "Hey, update a field in the backend database that it connected to," and you can retrieve the data too. So if I'm doing this test string here, type it in here. It's all in JSON notation, and it gives me an error. Let me see what the test. Oh, test string, capital S, of course. So this stuff is case sensitive. Oh, that's right. You can see since it knows the environment, it knows all of the wording and the syntax you can use. So I can pop this in, and right here it works. So that's a simple example, just to get us up and started. But let me show you something Jim also did, is the test string here. There's a no, this is the schema definition. Yeah, there's actually query we can use in graphical. Let me copy paste this into this. So this query says, okay, give me an author. So what he did is he attached a library to this that says, give me some mock data for any query of an author called James Edmond. And so this way, the way this works is there's a query function called author, and then there's a first name and last name as the parameter to this into this query. And then what do you want to get back? And then you tell GraphQL you want first name, last name, and you want the posts of this author. And then you want this also by title and by views, right? So this is all defined in a schema and in a resolver function. And then you can test it here. So this is sort of the test bed. It says, okay, let's run this. And on the right side, bam, here's the result, right? So here's author, first name, last name that I just queried. And then here's the post that Edmund created, right? So it's mock data, so this doesn't make any sense. It's not a real database, but it would be exactly the same as if this would be queried from a SQL database backend, or from a NoSQL database backend, or from an API. And that to me is almost mind-boggling, right? The query stays exactly the same, right? You say you want the author, and you just tell GraphQL, where do I get the author from, right? What is your data source? And you connect those two, and then you have it. So here's and then a test user interface that says, okay, let me pull out some data, make sure it runs, right? So the whole backend notion is resolved, is visible right here on your screen, right? Using this graphical thing. And you can then go into, I don't want to go too deep into that, but into the server side, it says, okay, so Jim installed there's an Apollo subdirectory here with a tutorial kit, and then there's a data folder, and then there's a schema file. And let me open this, and ta-da, here is the schema file for graphical. So right here you see there's type author defined as first name, last name, and posts, which is...
Can you make the type bigger?
No, this is... not in this stupid thing. Can I make it bigger in
Oh, you can make it up, Jim. You know what it says.
All right, fine.
Okay, it says first name, last name, and post, right? So, and post is an area of things. And then we add this, so define schema here, right? In this file here, define what is an author, what is a post, and then make it executable, sort of handing it over to say, hey, okay, anything coming in, show that on the front end. So that's the schema file, and then there's another one for the mockup that you saw. So that's kind of the resolver that says, okay, what do you actually want to show there? What do you want to return when I type in the author query, right? And then in this case, you see, we want to return the first name, and then he's using a function here from a library called Casual. And Casual is just something that pulls random text sequences, his casual sentences, random sentences out of, just generates these random sentences, right? And returns those as the post. And that's all there is. So you have these two tiny files here, right? Schema and mock. And you already have now the capability to say, I can query anything out of this backend database that we created. So backend database, quote unquote, meaning a mock-up of some fake title text, right? And some views that you pull out the database. So it's very transparent to me to say, hey, let's extend that schema now to, let's say, more fields, right? So first name, last name, I want to have email, I want to have location, whatever it is, right? And I can change the backend and say, I want to store this stuff in NoSQL now. Let's do that, right? It's just another connector that it create now. The nomenclature is connector, resolver, and schema, right? These three things. And bring them into the fold here. And then we are off and running with a new schema, new fields, without even thinking about the user interface yet, right? So notice there's no card here. Why is there no card? Because we haven't even started to think about what are we going to build on the front end, right? We know conceptually, that we want to have one of them is the card-based interface, but it can almost already run. You know, we can test it so much now to say we can agree on some of the fields here, right? We can agree on some of the queries that we're building. We can agree on the backends we're using, right? We can test all of this out, even without any user interface yet, right? So only use this graphical testing, and we can get as far as connecting everything to the backend, agreeing on the data fields, agreeing on the ways how to put it into the database and pull it out of the database as a query, and test this out. And the big, the testing thing is also included here. And now we can say, okay, backend is running. We have, as Jim mentioned, we have configured it, right? That's only a matter of configure. Say, I call this stuff here is really just a matter of sort of configuration, right? So if I add something like email :string to this, right? This is it. Now I just added a new field string. Unfortunately, Jim, I cannot access it. I have permission denied here. But I'm sure you're working on it.
I'll have to change it. I'll change your primary group to Apollo.
Okay.
You have to be in the Apollo group in order to modify.
Right. I figured, yeah.
And I sort of wanted to go through the exercise in a group to, this example includes a simple blog application.
Okay.
Is, I think, a very useful basis for the developers themselves. Starting with a sort of a simple built-in function that we can employ. For example, if we want to take a conversation on Facebook and create a little blog about it that we can link to the Facebook.
I like that. So Jim, let's do that. Let's do that in a special, different in a session, just talking about this block example, and go through that step by step.
And the other thing is to, you have schemas defined for cards already. We should include those schemas and use that as the starting point for our GitHub repository that we can work off of in order to cooperate and have when we push anything back to the repository in GitHub, have it automatically go into a running instance, which might be test, quality assurance, and production instances.
Mm-hmm.
Can I make this suggestion, please? Because I've just got to quit. I'm on the hour and I've got another meeting. This has been terrific. Really, really good stuff. Thank you very much. I look forward to more as it evolves and comes into shape and so on. But I just make one comment that I think the wallet functions of our card stack are going to be a critical test area, and we should, right from the beginning, look at wallet functions recording transactions. As a primary small scale, and we've got plenty of areas to play test bed with that. That will be both attractors and onboarders, offboarders, sideboarders. Who knows what borders we're onto here? So borders without borders, maybe.
Yes.
I'm gotta go. It's terrific, guys. Catch you later.
Thank you, Michael. Catch you later. Yeah. So let's Jim. Let's wrap up this session here. I don't want to make it too long for any viewers later. But I do want to say, let's do that. Let's step them through one tutorial using, this example that they provide, step by step, so people can follow along. And I have to get more familiar with that too, and add the other stuff, right? Because you stopped at this mock data thing, but there's more coming up, right? There's more writing resolvers for
Well,
the SQL and the NoSQL stuff.
right, and I basically wanted to review what was done so far, and then take the next steps and record them.
Mm-hmm.
Record the session of going through this process of creating the blog, and then introducing cards and identity constructs.
Right. The thing you can help me with, Jim, is make sure this Mongo thing is up and running. I don't know how to get that started. And then there's this third piece here, which is the engine, right? Adding the engine to the server. I'm not sure if you've done this already, but it looks like this thing here, right? We can actually start tracking performance and see some of the error messages that are coming back, and also start some caching with your data. If we can get this running too, that'd be great. I think that would be a cool thing to show in the tutorial.
Right. Yeah. Okay. I looked through it again. I simply installed the Mongo. I didn't do any configuration.
Okay. Yeah, I can do the configuration, and if you say it's running,
it's running. I just don't know.
We'll find out.
Find out what when we try to access it. Yeah, there's a lot to learn. And,
there is. Talking about lots to learn. There's one thing I wanted to ask you. So there's another tutorial here at the bottom of this, which is the full stack React and GraphQL tutorial, which to me is perfect. This is the other piece that we want to set up, which is around the front end, right? And I think he's using also React as a client. So it seems like we're zeroing in on React as the front end, React Native, and then GraphQL and Apollo as a backend out of the box, basically. Would you agree? Is that a good path?
Absolutely. React is certainly the de facto choice, and it's its model suits us well. What else we use is something else, but definitely React is on the has been on my stack for quite some time. More, in that it sort of mirrors, reactive methodology and philosophy to some extent as well.
Right. Plus the whole compilation component you have for creating almost native applications on mobile devices. I like that a lot, So the step is not too big for going from creating a React environment to moving that to React Native to create some mobile apps for that down the road.
Yeah, well, in the work study we did Apollo Native, which we didn't do much with, but Apollo Native you immediately have it on an app on an iPhone or Android.
Interesting.
So basically, we have, like you said, we have a really easy path to putting these on mobile apps.
Right. Excellent. Looks promising. So I think we're getting ready to have our stack solidified and ready to roll. And if we do a tutorial, a step through thing next time with an existing one, and then also start showing how the schema would look like with some of the cards, the card-based interface, the card, the context, and the user data. That would be the next, easy step, and then from there we can go into development mode. This looks pretty good to me. All right, thank you, Jim. And let me stop the recording.